真的是。
怎么啦？人家不是挺好吗？真名字应该是艺名。然后他就
新朋友好一点。你要是台上你没有，
天哪，他会打喷嚏的。热点开开，
知乎它的这个搜索条就是求粉丝。
现在知乎越来越不行了，很多东西都被评了。我没有拿牌牌，大家都没有。你拿牌牌了吗？
拿。
大家都没有拿牌牌，算掉，不管。大家都拿了牌牌，快去拿牌牌，对。你跳过去。都拿牌牌了，要去拿牌牌的。我
知道画抄笔抄，对。我说就靠这张脸下来，时间已经快我1倍了。你是？是，我是姐姐。我本来觉得我没有开心的，
你签了吗，佳子？
签了。
给那边。
啊天哪！为什么现在这课这么紧密？
对啊，我发现下星期的课好多呀。
嗨。
I have, for the end of the class, I have homework 1 and homework 2 with me. So first run. Obviously, as a teacher, I have to say I'm not so happy to keep you motivated. There are a couple of aspects which I'd like you to focus for the next next homework as well. Just remember that. Overall, I think the range is pretty good. But what I've seen is that in many instances, copy and paste from the book took place. I don't want that. I want you to read materials. I want you to describe with your own words the answers you think are right. I don't want copy paste from the book. Okay? Because then I don't see, if you just copy paste, the only thing I can recognize is yes, you find the right spot in the book, but I don't know whether you understood it. That's what I'm trying to get at. The next thing is, I've noted that in areas where it is easier to answer a question, the answer got longer and longer. Which is kind of natural. That's completely understood. It's normal when you have you know an answer to a certain topic, that you write as much as you can. It's not required. Remember KISS.
Keep it simple, stupid.
Or keep it simple and short. That is, you know, and I'm not kidding. This is one of the aspects. Legal writing. KISS. Remember that. Keep it short and simple. Keep it precise to the question. Don't make sentences longer as required. And whether you say keep it short and simple or short and stupid, doesn't matter. But remember that. It's easy to remember. Okay? Having said that, I also want you to answer the questions in a complete sentence, not bullet point style. And if the next level of bullet point style is just one single word, like buzzwords, I want you to explain that, so that you would answer to someone who is not knowing what you might mean, but to a third party whom you want to explain the question. Do not trust the internet. In the internet, you will find many answers, many ideas. The internet is not decisive for legal questions. That would only be books. I know that it's easy to first Google something. In many instances, you will get the correct answer, but not in every aspect. That just as general remarks. And that one you can remember for your life. I heard that the first time when I was a student in 2001 from my English partner in London, where I had a secondment. Never forgot that. Okay? So, the homework we'll distribute at the end, of course. It's not something I want you to look at right now. Let's talk about recap, transaction phases. Last week we had discussed phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of a transaction process. So let's talk about a private sale, a one-to-one situation. What would you see as document in the first phase of a transaction process?
Agree on the engagement letter, or enter into the engagement letter with the law firm or audit firm.
Yeah.
Could be by the seller or
you're perfectly right, but let's keep aside the advisors, just the M&A process. So just between the seller and purchaser. I should have said that. But you're right, engagement letter is one of the documents at the very beginning of the transaction process. You will see. Still, what else would you see between seller and purchaser at the very beginning, phase 1 of the transaction process? Like one-to-one situation.
NDA.
NDA, yes. First one. Another one?
Then it's LOI or MOU.
Yes, perfect. Teaser we do see in an auction process. What else do we see in an auction process in phase 1?
process.
Yes, what else? NDA.
Offer.
That's too early for phase 1. And we need to get started. The first one would be teaser, NDA, process letter, and what else? Information memorandum. Second phase, private sale first. So we have the NDA and we have the LOI or MOU. What happens next?
access to the data room.
You mind shutting your...
What? This is your slides.
Ah. Close it. Close it. No, of course you're right, access to the data room. What else? Utilities would be a logical consequence. Craft SPA.
But after the due diligence,
That's overlapping. Due diligence and SPA is overlapping. So towards the, well, it's difficult to say, it depends on the circumstance. Mid-term due diligence towards the end, the first draft SPA is typically provided. Who does provide the SPA in a private transaction? Typically. Buyer. And in an auction process?
Seller.
What else do we have in an auction process in the second phase compared to a private deal?
Shortlist.
shortlist
Yeah.
potential bidders.
Binding offers.
Is it binding offer or is it non-binding offer?
Non-binding offer is on the first phase.
Non-binding offer is before due diligence or after due diligence?
You mean the second stage or in the first stage?
Well, we said in the second stage due diligence will start. So would the non-binding offer be at the end of the first phase or at the end of the second phase?
First.
First or
First.
first? The tricky thing, and the answer would have been it depends. Depends on the process letter. And the reason why I'm doing this is I don't want you to really stick to the phases as I am presenting them. You will see everything in the transaction process. You will see pretty weird stuff. I think generally you should know the four phases, but be aware that these phases are connected. They may be overlapping. Let's talk about third phase. Third phase in a private deal. What would we do?
Confidential information.
Yeah.
And then
Sharing.
final negotiations.
Yeah. And for the auction process before that, we would need the binding offer. Yeah. Remember that also without the notes you have. Okay? Question will come again. Let's talk about the fourth phase, forming the deal. Once we have final negotiations, we at some point in time need to do a signing. For the GmbH, how do we sign? Notarization. Why is it sometimes the case that you have a split signing and closing?
Because there is a time gap between these two time points.
And why is there a time gap?
Because first you sign everything and then there is a period you check if there are any mistakes, then you can make up, or any further requirements you should be fulfilled required by the law, and then it's close to the deal.
Other suggestions or additions to that? The reason why we have a split signing and closing, or why we could have it?
of separation. You have to.
Well,
You give time for merger controls, regulatory approvals.
The question why you have a difference between signing and closing depends on the question whether there's a certain law, like merger control law, requiring a clearance from the respective authorities, and you are not allowed to sign and close at the same time. Or there are reasons negotiated between the parties that certain actions have to happen. So insofar the answer was absolutely right, but it was a bit on the high level. So remember, signing and closing, the split can happen because of conditions precedent, the law, merger clearance requirements, regulatory requirements. And again, it can also happen because of agreements between the parties that certain actions shall happen before a transaction is closed. For example, a carve-out of a business operation, or certain agreements have to be executed. Would you also agree, what you quite often see in transaction documents is the question of a rescission or termination rights? And also, of course, the fourth phase includes the post-merger, and actually it should say also post-completion, post-closing integration, which is a time-consuming process. It could go, it may take longer than expected. It's nothing that you do on day one, day two after closing. It's actually bringing together the company you have acquired with your own group. We have discussed notarization. Going back, signing, closing, what you mentioned on the separation principle. The separation principle is related to signing and closing, yes. Because at signing you have the obligation to sell, and at closing you have the actual in-rem transfer, which is separated. But that does not comprise the legal concept. Even if you have signing and closing at the same time, on an abstract level, you have on the one hand the obligation to sell something, and on the other hand you have the transfer. It's just at the same time. But still, legally, two separate acts. Okay? So, notarization, we have that. What about side letters? What notarization principle I'm talking about? You have to notarize the entire transaction documents. You cannot agree upon side letters which are not notarized. So if you have to go to the notary, you go with all documents to the notary. Clear? Closing conditions and closing actions. Closing conditions, as mentioned, that could be merger clearance or other regulatory approvals. Any suggestion what other regulatory approval that could be? I think we already have mentioned one in the past.
Antitrust.
That's merger. National Security Review, CFIUS, for the US. We have the same in Germany, which is, we have the same concept. Of course, the requirements are different. But National Security Review or Foreign Direct Investment Review, that would be something you typically find as a closing condition. What is the difference between closing conditions and closing actions? If you look at what would be a closing condition, what would be a closing action? Number one.
Closing condition would
Okay.
be the approval by cartel authorities.
Yeah.
And a closing action would be the delivery of documents.
Yeah.
Or the payment of purchase price.
Yeah. What about that? Required third party?
That is
CB.
a closing condition. Third party consent.
Depends on your negotiation power. Yeah. Required third party consent. That's something. Remember the change of control provisions. Change of control provision. Direct and indirect change of control provision. If you are the purchaser and you have contracts which you think are important as a change of control provision, would you want that consent to become a condition, a closing condition, or a closing action? Closing action? Action. Actually, you can answer it in both directions. The question is, what is the consequence of a condition to closing, the closing condition? What is the consequence of a closing action? If you have a closing condition, and the closing condition is fulfilled, you are obliged to close. And the other contractual party can sue you to close. Now, a closing action would mean you are obliged to close. Perhaps the seller cannot deliver the consent for the change of control. You are still obliged to close. And then depending on the legal consequences for the closing action, it may only be a postponing of the closing until that point in time the seller delivers the consent. If you are a strong purchaser, we'd like to have it as a closing condition, because typically the legal consequence, if a closing condition is not satisfied, there is a rescission right. You can walk away. Bless you. That is the question. What you're talking about, whether it's a condition to closing, a closing condition, or a closing action. How easy can you walk away as a purchaser? No legal impediment. No legal impediment means that there is no court ruling, no governmental decision that prevents the closing. That would be a closing condition as well, because that is something issued basically by the authorities, by a court. You cannot, neither party can close. That's a closing condition. You had a question.
I want to make sure that if the required third-party consent is a closing action, so it's like in your case, it's the seller's obligation to try to get the consent of that third party, and if the seller failed to do that, so the seller can have a obligation of the breach of the contract. So that's what I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Right. Again, this depends. That is a standard. It depends on what the parties negotiate.
Yes.
But in principle, that is what you typically see.
And then, if there is a breach of contract, which is the course, that breach of contract, the buyer can get the right to rescind the contract.
That is typically only for a closing condition. You can typically only rescind for a closing condition. The closing action is not delivered. You can sue for that, but you cannot rescind the agreement. So just the purchase price is not paid at closing. It's a closing action. Purchase price needs to be paid. of course, the shares will not be delivered by the seller because it does not get the purchase price, but it can sue the purchaser for the purchase price, and the purchaser cannot walk away because it's the obligation to pay. It's not a closing condition. Closing day, closing actions, they take place on the closing day typically. Sometimes if it's a very, it's a closing with many closing actions, you might not be able to do it on one day, and then actually it says closing day is the day the last closing action has been satisfied. It happens that you close over a couple of days. Just imagine wiring funds all over the world. That takes just time. Termination right, financing out. You don't see that. Yeah.
Sorry, about the change of control clause.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if I was a bad buyer, I would choose closing actions or closing condition.
Strong buyer would ask for it as a closing condition.
So closing condition has more benefit for strong buyer.
Gives the strong buyer more flexibility to walk away from the contract, to rescind the contract. Financing out, or actually a financing condition, is these days not acceptable. That would actually mean, as a closing condition, the purchaser implements a condition: I can only close if I secure financing from a bank. Sellers will not accept that. Sellers will request from the purchaser that financing is secured before signing the transaction. Any idea what the reason for that is?
I mean, you don't want the buyer to just move out of the deal?
That's one thing, yes. Another thing, the transaction becomes public after signing in most cases. That's a reputational issue. If the purchaser can simply walk away, that's a stupid seller then. If it allows the purchaser to walk away because of having no money. Transaction security also means financing security. As a seller, you will negotiate in a way that with the day of signing, irrespective of the fact that closing might be deferred, as of the day of signing, that you are secured to receive the purchase price. It's important. Yeah.
Even if it applies to the private company, I cannot fully understand it is also have some reputation problem with the private company.
Well, if obviously depends, but if you're a private company and you want to do an acquisition, and it becomes known in the market that you are not reliable as a business partner, that may also have an impact on your customers and on your suppliers. Try this as an automotive supplier with the OEMs. There will be no new business. It has a reputational issue. Of course, for a private equity, for a financial investor, for a sponsor, this issue is, or this issue might be more important, because for a private equity firm, it is their business concept to buy and sell. If they don't perform, they will be out of business and no longer invited to any transactions. But also for a private company, this can have reputational issues. Material Adverse Change Clause, MAC. Also Material Adverse Event, MAE clause. This is a clause, closing condition, which basically says if the financial, operational side of the target company deteriorates between signing and closing, through a material adverse event, then the purchaser has the right to walk away. Effect of a closing condition. You have the right to rescind. Material adverse change clauses are pretty common in other jurisdictions, for example, the US. In Europe, in Germany, it's hardly acceptable these days. Any idea why? It's not always about the principles. This is solely about the transaction market these days.
You normally define this MAC clause as a very broad clause, and a lot of situations can fall into it, and then buyer has a right. He will invoke the MAC clause and not perform the deal and not pay.
Mm-hmm. And we don't have it these days because it's a very seller-friendly environment. The seller has enough opportunities to sell the target, so they don't want to be bound by a MAC clause, because it's an easy right for the buyer to walk away. And if you see a MAC clause in a transaction, this is heavily negotiated. What qualifies as a MAC? What actually is a material deterioration of the business operations? Just as an example, you want to acquire a production site. That is why you pay the famous 100 million. Now, between signing and closing, the entire production site burns down entirely. There is a product, there's a operation interruption liability insurance, there is a fire insurance, so you will get 100 million from the insurance companies. Do you want to have 100 million from the insurance companies as a buyer? No. You are paying 100 million to get the production site. Would that be a material adverse effect? Well, you pay 100 million, you get 100 million. You don't lose anything, but you don't have the production side. So that would be something one would argue whether or not this is a material adverse event, material adverse change. Then you would say, as a seller, this fire was caused by an earthquake. How can I be responsible for that? So you would negotiate for this MAC clause responsibilities and burden of responsibility. Who is responsible for a material adverse effect of material adverse change, and what are the reasons you are responsible for? As a seller, you would not want to accept that. You want to be responsible for an earthquake. You haven't caused it. Still, the production side is gone. Again, is the concept clear? I will ask again on Thursday. MAC clause. Look into it.
So is that mean that you would like to put the risk of the force majority? You will allocate that risk among two parties through the material adverse change clause. It's just like the force majeure.
It's force majeure in commercial contracts.
Yes.
In commercial contracts, you would call that force majeure. In M&A transactions, you call it a MAC clause, material adverse change. But you're right. Principles in the force majeure clause, which is an earthquake is happening, a terrorist attack or a war or whatever, that may also have an impact on the MAC clause and the negotiation of the MAC clause.
It's only part of the debt or of the MAC clause. It's only part of the content, the negotiation content of this clause, or
yes, it's only part of it. You cannot compare a force majeure from the content to a MAC clause. Just the principle is the same. And you allocate responsibilities. Who is responsible for what? That is what a MAC clause basically does. It is in favor of the purchaser because, again, the purchaser has a right to walk away if the MAC clause is triggered. And given, as said, given the current situation, we don't see that actually in transaction documents. Sellers do not accept it. They say, as of signing, the risk and chances of the target transfer to the purchaser. Post-merger integration, post-closing integration. Of course, depending on the size, there are two main areas, I think. One is corporate governance, so that the management of the company you acquire is aligned with your own management rules, just to have the same set of rules for all your group companies. And the second thing is you wish to evaluate the areas where you can lift synergies, so where you can actually benefit from both companies now under one roof. So if you don't have overhead services twice, you only need it once. And that, for example, is if the company you acquire has an HR department, your group has an HR department, you don't need two HR departments. You may only need one plus a couple. That's lifting synergies. I think the rest should be pretty clear. There's typically a phase in which you as a transaction lawyer are no longer involved. Perhaps with the setting up of corporate governance, but then it fades out, and you're in most cases no longer involved in these post-closing operational aspects. Any questions?
If you have to lay off part of the employee for the purpose of synergy, what will that reflect in the transaction negotiation? Because you have to negotiate with how to deal with the employees, I think, in the transaction, in the negotiation.
Depends. It depends. Typically, it is a matter for the purchaser post-closing, not to be discussed with the seller. In case the company or the group you want to acquire is in a restructuring phase and has employees who are tariff bound and has a labor union and has a works council, then it may happen that in the transaction documentation there is language, there are obligations to secure the workforce for 2, 3, 5 years after closing. Guarantees from the purchaser towards the workforce, that happens. But in a normal M&A situation, you would simply acquire the target, and then you would look into where and how you would lay off employees. Laying off employees is not so easy. There is an act in Germany, it's the Act Against Unfair Dismissal, so you cannot really do cherry picking. You have to do social security plans, reconciliation plans. It's not like you can go in and say, okay, I have now 200 employees more on the payroll, I need only 100, and simply get rid of them. It would actually be a mass layoff.
But is it a liability automatically transferred to the purchaser? The employee cannot lay off them, but they are alternate the employee agreement. They are automatically transferred to the purchaser. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. For a share deal, it's 100% right, because the employment relations between the company where you acquire and the employee, so it's not changed by the transaction whatsoever. In an asset deal scenario, if the employees follow by statutory law, they again follow with all the rights and obligations under their employment agreements, except if they object, then they don't follow. And then in the transaction documentation, in the asset deal, you have to discuss what happens with employees who object to the transfer, because they remain with the seller. The seller actually may not want them anymore. Different story.
I still I'm a little confused about the closing condition. And you mentioned before that the strong buyer had more flexibility to walk away, but you also mentioned that another party can suit the buyer to close. So how to balance these two questions?
It's not another party, it's the seller who can sue for closing. Because the contract is only between seller and purchaser. So if the closing conditions are fulfilled, the purchaser and also the seller, they are obliged to close. So you can sue them for closing. Which means you can sue them to come to the closing table. You can sue them to pay the purchase price. You can sue them to hand over the shares. If you have a closing condition which is not fulfilled, or which happened to take place, i.e. a MAC clause, or a financing out, you had a financing clause and you don't have financing in place, you can simply tell the seller, I don't have financing. This condition, closing condition is not satisfied. I cannot close. Which at some point in time means that either party is entitled to rescind the agreement. And that is what is called walk away. You can simply say, I cannot get funding. And then you are not obliged to close. You cannot be sued to close. You cannot even be sued to get financing at worse terms. There's no longer an obligation to close. Closing action, you are obliged to close. You can be sued to close. If you don't deliver something at closing, you can be sued to deliver, and you will win that in court. No right to walk away. Okay? So let's talk about due diligence. Any idea what due diligence is? What kind of due diligence do we have? Two types.
Strategy, finance,
Financial legal.
Bad question, I confess. Bad question.
But the book says strategic and operational.
And operation.
The operation.
Sorry, bad question. Buyer and vendor due diligence was what I was looking for. Now let's talk about types of due diligence. We had financial. We had operational. What else do we have? Legal. What else? That's all? HR. Yeah.
tax contracts,
Tax is fine, contract is legal.
tax
Or lender's due diligence.
Sorry?
Lender's due diligence, if there is a third party asset.
You sometimes find them. Yeah. What do the lenders typically do?
To look at the target company or the buyer or the purchaser, if there is any issues he has to notice as a lender, if there are potential issues. Anyway, he just wants to get his money for security.
Yeah, that's good. And for the last point, he basically looks at the buyer due diligence reports. Two things that lender due diligence. One thing is you check the borrower, which would be the purchaser, whether or not it's a valid, sustainable company. And the second thing is you check the operations, because your financing will be secured against assets of the operations you finance. So that is why you will look at the due diligence reports of the buyer. Okay. Due diligence, we have to do it. Caveat emptor, that's the principle. Buyer, be aware. Under German law, under the civil law concept, it's not an obligation of the seller to tell you anything. You cannot rely on anything the seller says. It is your obligation as a purchaser to review what you're buying. That is why we do a due diligence. So buyer due diligence conceptually is a result of this principle. Why is there sometimes a vendor due diligence?
Fix their problem beforehand, so they will make sure they will have some certain what will the buyer find, and then they will avoid reducing price.
Yeah. Everyone heard that? You can review the company as a seller beforehand to identify risks and potentially cure those risks before you open up the data room for the bidders, for the purchaser. That basically means that you have the same set of information as a seller, like the purchaser will have once they did the buyer due diligence, which will be the same level of negotiation power. You cannot be surprised, ideally, unless your advisor oversaw something. Another argument for vendor due diligence.
I think it supplements the buyer due diligence. This basically buyer has a way to look at things and try and compare.
Yeah, you can use this as a tool to tell the purchaser the due diligence will go quicker, because the purchaser will receive the vendor due diligence report, which is setting out all the facts contained in the documents in the data room. So it should speed up the process for the purchaser. What is the downside of a vendor due diligence report?
It might have some presentations.
Yeah, it's expensive is the first thing. Second thing, time consuming, because you have to do the vendor due diligence report before you start with the buyer due diligence. Representations, I would say no. If I understand you correctly in the way that someone would rely on the vendor due diligence report. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, representations.
And it is, a vendor due diligence report is only presented to the buyer or the bidders based on a non-reliance letter. So that actually the buyer, the purchaser, cannot rely on this report. Any reason why that is the case?
Buyer may have a suspicion that maybe this is not a company which is doing very well, and maybe that is why they want to sell it, and they may be misrepresenting certain aspects of the company in the report to get a better price.
But that's a problem for the purchaser, whether it relies on that report or not. But yeah, that's the point. No liability for the advisor who prepared the vendor due diligence report towards the purchaser, because that's a third party. The vendor due diligence report has been prepared solely for the seller, no one else. It will be made, the purpose is, of course, to be made available to the bidders, but only on the basis of a non-reliance letter. Clear? Skip that. Due diligence is a pretty complex thing. It is a process. You have teams, you have specialists for various legal areas. Despite the legal due diligence, you have financial due diligence, you have tax due diligence. I think these are the three most important ones from external advisors. Commercial and operational due diligence is mostly done by the client, because that's his business. But even that you can have, and let's jump through that. Legal due diligence, tax due diligence, financial due diligence, integrity due diligence, and commercial due diligence. Integrity due diligence, think of compliance with law. Everything which relates to crime and compliance management, that could be reviewed in a compliance or integrity due diligence. This is kind of a fancy thing these days. In the legal due diligence, you will also check whether or not there's compliance with laws. Now, you can do only two things. Check the documents, whether they comply with law, but you will never, respectively, rely on management confirmations that there is no corruption. But you will not be able to prove it in the data room, because no one would put a document in the data room and say, hello, I sent money to the following customer to get the contract. So you will not be able to find that on the face of the documents, but it's part of the legal due diligence to look after compliance with law. There are separate integrity due diligence these days, because compliance is a very important aspect currently. Of course, you have heard about the diesel scandal with VW. There are numerous compliance investigations these days, and they all tie to enhanced liability of management, including the criminal liability, which basically came from the US and the UK with the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and the UK Bribery Act. It's nothing new for Germany. We have in our criminal code all those acts to prohibit corruption, bribery. But you may know that the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act, they claim a worldwide coverage. That is, for example, a German company having business in the US is subject to the FCPA even for aspects and business it does with Spain, just because it has a relation to the US. Same is true for the UK. So given that, we have a stronger focus on compliance with law, and economic crimes, so corruption, bribery, and so forth. That's not everything what we see in terms of due diligence. We also see environmental due diligence. For environmental due diligence, remember, don't dig. Environmental due diligence is typically divided in two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is walking around, looking at the production site, checking where the hazardous material is stored, checking how they maintain, how they work, how they handle hazardous materials, check at their waste dump system, this kind of visual checks, walking around. Phase 2, making holes, digging, taking samples from the soil and groundwater. If you dig, you will find something. And that's the reason why for environmental due diligence, as a seller, the rule is don't dig. And of course, there are areas where an environmental due diligence leads to certain results. There are areas in Germany which are declared chemical production sites. They are listed in the waste cadastral map. So there's a specific map kept at the authorities where waste and environmental pollution has been detected in the past. If you have something like that, there's no reason to dig because everyone knows that there is something. The point is, if you want to do a transaction and someone is starting to dig, first thing is you will find something, you will have to inform the authorities, there will be remediation coming for this specific issue. You will hardly be able to check whether or not the pollution came from the factory or, for example, from a neighboring real estate. If you have a production site on the green field, somewhere on a land of grass, there's likely nothing, and there's no reason to do something. If you are in an area where you have companies, where you have production sites, it's likely that something is there. And as I said, if you dig, you cannot really separate whether or not the pollution came from the neighboring real estate. So typically you don't do it. Don't dig. Also, you can have insurance due diligence, which you typically, in the legal due diligence, you will say, yes, there is a policy for business interruption. There's a policy for directors in office insurance. So there's insurance out there. What you will not check in the legal due diligence is whether or not the insurances adequately cover the business risks. That is done by an insurance company. In a legal due diligence, you would actually check, have there been claims in the past which have been made towards the insurance companies? Have they been denied, and for what reasons have they been denied? You will get a feeling on how on the operations of the company, whether or not there are many cases which may have which may give you an insight on the safety of products, for example, on operations. If you have always fire in the house, I guess the fire prevention measures should be improved. So you will be able to make some conclusions, but you will not be able or to be in a position as a lawyer to say the insurance coverage as such is sufficient, because you don't know. HR due diligence, we mentioned that. Again, that is more in relation to cost and value of personnel. It's not the legal side of things. The legal side of HR is, are the employment contracts valid? Do we have collective bargaining agreements? What is the content of such kind of agreement? Do we have shop agreements? That is basically, do we have a works council? Do we have tariff agreements? Do we have union? That's legal. HR due diligence is more the cost side of things. IT due diligence, I think, is clear by itself. Same for IP. Technical due diligence, I think, is also clear. You cannot do that as a lawyer. Technical due diligence would be looking at the production facilities, at the machinery. Is that ordinary wear and tear? Is everything operating, or do you expect investments to be made into the machinery, which may have an impact on purchase price, for example? So that could all be due diligence areas. Now let's go back to the process. So I was talking about complexity. If you look at all those due diligences, I think it's pretty clear that as a due diligence provider, as a service provider, you are only a piece of a larger group of advisors. And everything needs to tie together. So you want to have, as a client, all due diligence reports pretty much at the same time, with the exception of the financial due diligence. Quite often, you start with the financial and commercial due diligence to first check whether the numbers are what you expect financially to to go hand in hand with your purchase price, with your expectation of the business. Only if that is as expected, you would engage legal due diligence. Because if the first thing is already way out of what you're thinking, there's no need to spend the costs for legal advisors. But again, it all has to be organized on the purchaser side. So that's teamwork. You have to coordinate that. At the same time, clients want to have it as cheap as possible, which has always an impact on the diligence, how deep you dive into the data room, what the scope of work is. Of course, this work can be cheaper if you only look at corporate, but then you may not look at corporate finance, at commercial, at contracts, at the legal side of HR, IT, IP, litigation. Of course, you can cater the scope of work in a way that's cost efficient, but that's not ideal for the client. Most important thing is communication. Talk to the client. Agree upon schedules. Agree upon deliverables. That is a very open process. The more communication there is, the less disappointed expectations there are. In a due diligence, and this is kind of going back to, well, actually it's not. You can find due diligence in two ways. One is a virtual data room. That's pretty much standard. But you can also have a physical data room. Sometimes, and I think I said that already, a physical data room you may have for the very, very sensitive, confidential documents at the very end of a transaction process, shortly before signing. Now, either way, if you have a virtual data room or a physical data room, it is, from my point of view, important, once agreed with the client in terms of scope, to start right away. Don't lose time. Get your team to work immediately. Everything else tends to have the consequence that the due diligence is floating around and you won't be able to collect all work streams, all work results in time. So while there is this overall group of due diligence providers, legal, financial, tax, they all have to provide at the same time, within a group for the legal due diligence, for the financial due diligence, you have a team. And this team needs to report on the same days, with the same level of communication, with the same focus on their areas, but concise in terms of writing. Just imagine I take your homework one and make one due diligence report of it. There is no concise formatting. There is no concise usage of abbreviations. There is no concise spelling. If you find that as a team leader for a due diligence, you have to consolidate each and every document so that you have in the end one document which has the same feel and look and feel as each part of that. That is a huge workload which costs days and nights, and you can optimize that, respectively try to limit this kind of work if at the very beginning you communicate what you want in terms of scope, in terms of form, in terms of formatting, in terms of abbreviations. Communication, there we are. Data room rules, behavior in the data room, virtual data room. Typically, you are not allowed to print. You are not allowed to take photocopies. You are not allowed in a physical data room to tear pages apart, put them in different folders, so you have to behave. I think that's pretty obvious. Interestingly enough, in every physical due diligence, You find people writing in the documents, you find yellow post-its somewhere, and all this kind of stuff. Don't do it. If you have a virtual due diligence, so an electronic data room, yes, it makes sense to sometimes read the data room rules which you have to accept before you look into documents. There's typically it says no photocopies. Virtual data room, you have it on the screen. You can make pictures. You can make pictures of drawings, of patent applications, of important documents, and you can have someone writing it all down. And then you have copied data room, the document. You cannot prevent that as a data room provider or as a seller. So what you have to do is, besides the contractual obligation to not do it, so the one who's actually doing it would be subject to or could be subject to a lawsuit if you can prove it, and if you can prove the damage. That's a nightmare. That also leads to the consequence that in a virtual data room you don't have control of what is done with the information. Yes, you have confidentiality. You don't have control what is done with the information. For that reason, you have to carefully think about what you include in a virtual data room in phase 1 of the virtual data room. Or whether there are any documents you only want to include in a redacted, black-lined version, so that some areas of this document are not visible and are only provided at the later stage. You have to think about that. Otherwise, you have no control. Now, going back on the view of the bidder, of the purchaser, looking into the data room, team and communication means in a data room you will sometimes find documents. You're looking after documents under German law, in the folder German law documents. And you may find in that folder documents which are subject to non-German law. That does not mean that you don't review them. It does not mean that you keep silence about these documents. It means that you have to inform someone that there is a document which is not subject to German law, which has to be reviewed. As a team member, you inform the team leader. As a team leader, you inform the client. Because obviously you don't want to review a document under a law which you cannot advise on. That would make yourself liable. But you have to tell the client there is something and he should organize a review if the client deems appropriate. Communication. That's view beyond and above the horizon. Look left and right and communicate if there's something which you think does not belong to your part of the due diligence. If we mentioned that, vendor due diligence report, if there's a vendor due diligence report or a fact book, you may have to deal with short timelines. And also, the idea of a virtual data room is it's available 24/7. It's not nice on the advisors. In the data room, the world is not perfect, which means that when reviewing documents, you will have questions as the reviewer. You need to communicate these questions. There is typically a tool, question and answer tool. Sometimes it's provided in the data room itself. Sometimes it's a separate document shared amongst the advisors, but you have to communicate that. The next thing is that if you are the one populating the data room, so the seller, there is sometimes a tendency to put everything in the data room what you can find. That's not helpful. That is, I like that data dump. Just everything is in the data room. No view on importance, no order of things. Obviously, as a reviewer, you have to deal with that. It depends on the negotiation power, whether you can actually force the seller to work on the data room, which you can only do in a one-on-one procedure. You cannot do it in an auction process. In an auction process, it is what it is. As a lawyer, you may be entitled to participate in management meetings. That's a maybe. Same is true for site visits. The management meetings and the site visits are mostly used for financial questions, strategic questions, not for legal questions. And so are the site visits. Unfortunately, we are not always we don't always have the chance to look into the companies we sell and buy, which is quite fun sometimes. We spoke about that, the famous types. Important. Many people say you do a due diligence because it needs to be done, but once you have the book, as a businessman, you just do the deal, you have done your homework, you have been diligent, but it basically has no consequence on the transaction. This is utterly wrong. And then the due diligence was designed entirely wrong. The due diligence should have, or could have an influence on the investment decision. You know, if you find risks, and I'm not speaking only for legal due diligence, if you find risks, you may want to reflect them in the purchase price. You may want to reflect them in the reps and warranties. You may want to reflect them in the indemnities. Or you may even want to reflect them in a closing condition, something which needs to be done between signing and closing. For example, a carve out of a risky business operation in a country you don't want to do business with. You can structure the transaction depending on the results of the due diligence. You're looking into a share deal, but you find enormous tax liability in the company. The tax liability relates to the company, to the legal form, to the legal person. It does not relate to the assets. So the option might be an asset deal, keeping the tax liabilities behind with the seller. Company valuation, I think, is pretty clear. The things I was just talking about is risk assessment, allocating risks in the reps and warranties, in the indemnities, financing. Now, if the banks view that the asset situation is not sufficient to grant the acquisition financing because there's not sufficient collateral in the assets, you have an issue because then deal security is gone. Contract design, I mentioned that, reps and warranties. Disclosures, anyone an idea what disclosure could be? Very generally, we come to that anyway. If you have a representation in the share purchase agreement, which, for example, says the company has no litigation, that's a wrap. The disclosure would be, except as disclosed in the annex, the company has no litigation. And in the annex, you have listed all those litigation cases where the company is a claimant or a respondent at signing. And the consequence of this disclosure is that the warranty is correct, although there are litigation cases. As a purchaser, you cannot make a claim because the litigation cases have been disclosed in the warranty. That's a disclosure. You see that sometimes as disclosure letter, disclosure memo, or disclosures to a specific clause. Compliance becomes more and more important. You can use a due diligence also for compliance matters, post-merger, post-closing, so that you have reviewed the corporate governance of the target, and you know what you have to change post-closing to implement your own corporate governance. But also, going back to reps and warranties, it is always a representation compliance with law. That could be disclosures. If there are areas where there's non-compliance, this could be areas which have to be complied with before you close a deal. Various aspects. You can see and find different presentations for due diligence report. The full due diligence report on the left-hand side, you hardly see these days. A full due diligence report basically describes, very descriptive, every legal document in the data room, whether it's material or not. This has changed over the years, so that in most cases these days you see a limited due diligence report or a red flag report. This is actually somewhat overlapping. A 100% red flag report would mean you only report red flags, showstoppers. Best case, you look at the data room and you send the client a white sheet of paper. No red flags. Best case. Clients, in many cases, don't want to or do not understand this concept because obviously they pay 5-digit, 6-digit numbers for a due diligence and then they get a white sheet of paper with a price tag of whatever, or 90, 290. So you typically, and the same is true for a risk sheet, by the way. Risk sheet, risk yes or no. There's no in between. Of course you can say high risk, medium risk, low risk. Low risk is no risk. Depends on your definition of risk. That always is for the lawyers to define, which is a discussion you have to have with the client. What is the client considering a risk? Having 1,000 employees in the company and 10 employees being on a lawsuit for unfair dismissal, no one cares. It's not a risk. Having 950 employees on a litigation, that might be a risk, or on a strike. Yeah. So that's something you have to discuss with the client. The limited legal due diligence report and the red flag report is quite common these days, with partially descriptive elements, mainly because of two aspects. If you advise a foreign investor, the foreign investor might want to know a bit more than only risks. He might want to understand how the data room looks like. He wants to get a feeling of, for example, there are 20 customer contracts in the data room. The customer contracts comply with standard market terms. One of the customer contracts has a change of control provision, which is only a direct change of control provision, so not triggered in this transaction. So they may want to have a short summary of the status, just to get a better understanding. The second portion is warranty and indemnity insurance. It will come again, but remember warranty and indemnity insurance. This basically means the seller doesn't want to be liable for the reps and warranties, but an insurance provider shall be liable. This is a pretty standard concept here. In most transactions you see WI insurance. Now, as an insurance, only insures what has been properly due diligence. You won't get a WI insurance if you only present a white sheet of paper. The insurance company wants to look at the due diligence reports, wants to get an understanding whether an area has been properly due diligence, thereby minimizing its own risk. if an insurance company sees that a reputable law firm has checked the chain of title of a GmbH, it is pretty much on the safe side that nothing is going wrong here. Then you will get insurance. If the insurance provider is not seeing any due diligence with respect to the chain of title, so ownership and shares, you won't get insurance.
Would this insurance provider actually get to see the buyer's due diligence report as well?
Yes, on a non-reliance basis. And they will, actually in a call they will tell you that they rely on the reports, but legally they are not entitled to. But that is the reason why they want to have limited due diligence reports, red flags reports. They don't want to have a white sheet of paper, they want to see a proper due diligence. Then you get WI insurance. I like that. And it's only here, 4th phase only, so that's an easy one. That was recap, only 4th phase. And then the 2 questions. I will upload it. No, good point. You don't need to submit on the first day. But on the first day there will be another set of forms. And well, next week we have Friday, right? Next week Friday, yeah. So next week Friday. Yeah, that's it. Any questions on today's session? Yeah.
A question. You said that on the slide that one of the due diligence results insurance is that the legal part of the due diligence result is concerned with the compliance. But you have mentioned that there is a separate group who are responsible for the compliance insurance. So I'm a little bit confused.
Lawyer's answer, it depends. In case there is no integrity or compliance due diligence engaged or entrusted, you won't have it.
Yeah.
Then you might have aspects of it in the legal due diligence. In the end, you need to view all due diligence reports and check whether they have a consequence on the transaction. So there is an overlap, legal due diligence and compliance due diligence on the area, but it's not a 100%.
And I have a want to ensure that with the definite consumption of the compliance is that you have to check like the outside regulation rather than the data room information. You can base on the data room information and then check the outside regulation part, like you mentioned the US or US.
They will also check outside information, but it's quite difficult to find the correct outside information. So, for example, you could review you could look into criminal records, but that's not publicly available. So that's not something, you can only do that with consent, which wouldn't be part of the legal due diligence anyway. You may look into, well, you can do Q&A with business partners, for example, to see whether there's corruption or not, but you know, that is difficult to find out. As a lawyer, you wouldn't do that.
And would that be a case in practice that even you find a lot of legal issues and legal risks, if you want to acquire that company,
yes.
If you you measure the risk and the economic effect,
you find all aspects. If you find that a purchaser wants to acquire this company and the purchaser does not care about the legal risks, you find in due diligence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the argument, you know, I get it for a cheap dollar, I take the risk. That's business judgment. All right, so let's circulate the homework. And perhaps you start here, just take out yours and circulate. There are two homeworks with having no results. This is because this is 100% identical. Which means either you have done it together, or one has copied. You know, I'm fine with working together, but I want individual homework. All right. And of course, if there are questions, let me know. We can discuss.
家宝，家宝一家。
我的妈呀！
你的？谁的？
这是我的。
加制的就是我的呢？我的呢？
This one, the two, right? The two homeworks?
是不是评分了？这不是分，我感觉这是分啊。
加吧。
不知道。太可怕了！我这题作业不想交了。我也是，我全是抄的后面。我这个作业也是抄的这期的，找。他说公猜写，结果他也太认真了。这都他写的啊？不知道啊。
At least what we see from the market, it's not almost so that's
I was in India, because they were not M&A in the 3 years. I think M&A always doesn't bring service representation. So what do you do from that perspective?
这是什么意思呀？
Like coming here, when I
helps me actually.
他这个打分就是分。今天的作业交吗？
How much did you get?
Oh, sorry. Today's homework. 哎，问一下，他刚才是说有人把2次作业交一块了。不知道，没有说呀。他刚才说有人是 work together， 还有一些是 textbook 抄的。我就是 textbook。我这次作业也有 textbook， 这个 textbook。你的学姐有告诉过你这会批作业吗？没有。他是故意没有告诉你还是什么？不清楚，我都没问他这种事情谁会，我也不知道他会批作业。
打分越高越好，对不对？
越好呀。
不是，他要发下来。
这分儿越高越好，越低越好。为什么？因为德国的就是这样子呀。这样的，它每一题单个分肯定是越高越好。不是，越低越好。越低越好。这么可怕？是 today's homework? Okay.
还有一分啊！
我有2分，我也。
第2分是在。
完了，我这次作业也是全抄 text。
Is that homework from everyone?
而且还都是布列框。
是啊。
我不是布列框，抄的呀。我 只有一个分儿，我交在一起了。挺好的，没事儿。大家都是抄的，但是我有reference，我都那样。
If you want to know about scores, that is German scoring. Number 1 is perfect. Number 2 is good. Number 3 is sufficient. Number 4, 5, I haven't given any 5, that's bad. 6 is worse. Okay? So it's German scoring. From everyone. Okay. If you don't have questions, guys, if you don't have questions today, I know that you look into these things. Feel free to chat. Feel free to contact me. Happy to discuss these things. And other than that, we're done for today. Okay?
Excuse me, I didn't get my session 2's homework. Is this
lost in translation? Okay, can everyone check whether you have a double or extra page, please?
Never mind. Okay.
If not, I'll check back on.
Okay, thank you.
If you have it electronically, send it again to me.
Okay,
Anybody got one? You got how much?
啊，那我就有。对啊，那你是很爽吗？哎，可是他前面都给我看了，我已经懂了。
He reads each and every line and fuck in this one. I thought he's not reading the first one. Yeah. And the third one, I just gave it like this.
I thought it was just formality repulsion.
He read each and every word.
He said you guys